Good afternoon to you. Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com, here with your Hurricane Pro and HD video blog for the first day of July 2013. Hope you're having a good Monday. I know it's wet for a good part of the southeast with that stalled frontal boundary. At least the tropics are behaving, and that should be the way it is this time of year. This is the July 1st through the 10th climatology map showing points of origin for tropical storms and hurricanes. This does not include any subtropical storms nor any tropical depressions. This would be tropical storms and hurricanes over about the last 100 years during this first 10 days of July. And you can see there are a few areas now between Africa and the Lesser Antilles. Really nothing to speak of in the Caribbean Sea. A little bit of a concentration in the Gulf of Mexico. A little bit up here off the southeast coast and around Bermuda. But by far the most active area in the Atlantic or the East Pacific is the Eastern Pacific. It is favored this time of year with quite a bit of activity over the past 100 years or so. This area is just prime this time of year, whereas the Atlantic Basin still dealing with upper level winds that are too strong, dry air that comes off of Africa in the form of these large Saharan air layer outbreaks with dry air and dust. And it's just one of those things that's hard to, I guess, really wrap your brain around, that why would the Eastern Pacific be so active and the Atlantic Basin relatively inactive when they're so close to each other, relatively speaking. And it's just the way it is with meteorology and the tropical cyclogenesis, or how these tropical storms form. It takes the Atlantic Basin just a little bit longer to percolate. That's not a meteorological term, but I think you know what I'm saying. It takes a lot longer for that pot to boil than it does for the Eastern Pacific. So looking at sea surface temperature anomalies for this week as we start off the month, very cold right here in the extreme Eastern Pacific, still rather cold across the rest of the tropical Pacific, with a few areas of positive anomalies showing up, giving us basically this mixture that all adds up to being a neutral signal overall. The El Nino nowhere to be found, that abnormal warming of the Pacific nowhere to be found. On the other side of the continents here, in the eastern Atlantic, quite a bit above the average with sea surface temperature anomalies. The Gulf and Northwest Caribbean also running quite a bit above average. And then you've got this cold relative to normal in between the warm Northwest Atlantic and the very warm southern part of the tropical Atlantic. And this is still just the classic makeup for a very busy peak to the hurricane season, which begins next month. We're about a month away from the tropics, I think, really starting to come to life, if we don't have a couple of developments this month, which I think we might, considering the favorable nature to the Madden-Julian oscillation that is supposed to move into the Atlantic Basin. That upward motion period is moving right along. Wanted to take a look at the El Nino Southern Oscillation too, since we're talking about sea surface temperature anomalies and El Nino and whatnot. The SOI is a good indication of the pressure pattern across the tropical Pacific, and when we see it positive, like it has been for the better part of the year so far, that is the indication of not El Nino conditions. This is much more of your neutral condition. If we saw it strongly positive, like we saw here back in 2011, that's more of a La Nina type signal, and we're not really seeing that. This is just within the threshold of your neutral signal, fairly solidly so, I might add, and there's just no indication of that warming of the Pacific that would cause an El Nino to occur. In fact, looking at the mid-June, we'll have another one for early July here coming up soon. This is your model consensus. You look at all the different models from the dynamical to the statistical. You get a consensus, if I can say it, and that's sort of this purple line right here. Where is that? Well, that runs right about like that. I'll outline it in red for you. And you can see that the consensus from the Climate Prediction Center of all these different models is just below the zero, the absolute neutral threshold. So just this side of cold neutral. And we're looking at really this time period right here, August, September, October, and it is just a little bit colder than neutral. Not enough to call it a La Nina, the abnormal cooling of the Pacific, but I think what should jump out here is we don't have Any model at the peak of the hurricane season around this time frame right here, none of the dynamical or statistical models, the averages, the consensus models, none of them, zero, show an El Nino during the peak of the hurricane season right here. And that's important because that means we should have a very active August and September, and I hope that people are ready because the pattern looks like it's going to really mean business once we get into that active period. Today, things are nice and quiet. The tropical Atlantic almost completely empty of any organized convection. A few tropical waves and upper level disturbances, surface trough, cold front draped over, you name it, just kind of a messy pattern across portions of the Gulf and the western Atlantic near the Carolina coast and Florida and Georgia. Not a very good beach day, but at least nothing with a name on it coming at you, right? And it looks like it's going to stay this way for the next several days as strong, very dominant high pressure remains in control out over the tropical Atlantic, forcing that influence, that surface high, deep down into the tropics, keeping the intertropical convergence zone squashed down towards the equator, and that'll prevent anything from developing anytime soon. Well, we'll be watching the chance for a disturbance to pinch off from the 500 millibar pattern and come around the bottom of the Bermuda High that sits out here, kind of rotating around it, coming this way. Some of the computer models suggesting that maybe that'll interact with a tropical wave coming out of the deep tropics, and we might have something to watch here in the Bahamas, Southwest Atlantic region over the next 5 days. Pressures are pretty high out there, though, so it's not very likely, but it is something to keep your eyes open for. Some of these small systems that form like that can ramp up pretty quick. We'll make sure we keep our eyes wide open for something like that. Some of the models showing it. In the eastern Pacific, still have Tropical Storm Delilah getting ready to make that turn to the west out over colder water, away from Mexico, so folks in Cabo San Lucas and any and all of the resort areas of Mexico have nothing to worry about in terms of direct influences from Delilah. Maybe a few showers right along the coast and an increase in surf, but that's it. Minimal impact from Delilah. It's going to make that turn and then head out to the west over this colder water of the eastern Pacific, and it too will be gone in a few days, and that will be that. And we will wait and see what comes up next. All in all, things are nice and quiet as we start the month of July. Typically, I think the point to take away from this is that July is usually a quiet month, although this one might have a little bit of activity after the 15th because of that favorable Madden-Julian oscillation of upward motion that is supposedly going to work its way into the Atlantic basin. We'll just wait and see if that happens. For now, let's take the quiet and run with it. Why not? Have a good rest of your Monday. Again, I'm Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. That's my site. Always a privilege to do these videos for you for Hurricane and Hurricane Pro and Hurricane HD, the iPad version. I'll be back with much more for you tomorrow.